So welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know, I'm David Wilkins. I'm the director, the faculty director of the Center on the Legal Profession. This is our weekly speaker series in which we bring people who are doing interesting work around the world on a whole range of issues related to the legal profession. And it gives me particular pleasure today to introduce Shweta Balakrishnan, who was a student here as an LLM student. She was a fellow in the program on the legal profession, as we were then called before we graduated to being a center. She is also a collaborator on a project that we've talked about in this room a few times, which is the project on globalization, lawyers, and emerging economies, or GLEE, as we like to call it, after the popular TV show. I don't know if Shweta is going to sing, but she's not wearing a sweatsuit anyway. But that project is really path-breaking in the sense that it's trying to understand the developments in the legal profession, which we talk about here a lot, but from the perspective of some of the most important new emerging economies of the world. And Shweta's project there is really central to what we're trying to do, because it's trying to understand what's happening with respect to gender in the legal profession in these important economies, with particular reference to India. The project is part of Shweta's dissertation. She's now a PhD student, almost done at Stanford. And it's already being cited by other scholars, both junior and senior, around the world as really path-breaking in terms of its understanding of the multiple layers in which gender operates and the ways in which the context of the emerging world may make gender issues look quite differently, at least on some levels, than they do here, or we're used to here in the United States. So it's both theoretically rich and incredibly practically significant, and we're very proud of her. So with that, I give you Shweta Balakrishnan.
Yeah.
Yeah, give her a round.
It's really, really nice to be here. As David says, I started this project when I was here, so in some ways it was conceived in CLP. And it was very different. When the project started, it was a very different project than it is now. It started as a globalization of emerging markets project. I was interested in how large law firms in India looked and responded to globalization. And one set of fieldwork later, it became a gender project, right? For those of you that are interested in gender research and gender scholarship, this is slightly different from how a lot of people start their projects. I didn't go in looking for a gender finding, so the fact that the gender finding popped in my face was really miraculous in some sense. So this was actually the interview that made me start thinking that this was not just a globalization project, this was a gender project, right? I was talking to a senior partner. This was a woman that had spent some time in New York, not a lot, but she had spent, I think, 3 weeks in a immersion program in a New York law firm, and she'd gone back. And I was talking to her about tell me a little bit about your partnership track. When did you start at the firm? What kind of work do you do? And then she said, I realized 1 hour into the conversation, she had not brought up the fact that she was a woman in a large law firm, right? For somebody that studies women and work dynamics here, for somebody that knows the literature, you'd expect a senior lawyer in a large law firm to at least mention the fact that being a woman mattered in some sense, right? And she said this to me. She said, she was talking about a brunch that actually a partner had in the New York law firm. And she said, this partner looked at me and said, how many of you walked into the room and had people mistake you for a secretary or a paralegal? She was talking to the women that she was having brunch with, which were other women, junior women and senior women at the New York firm. And I love the surprise that this partner had, right? She says, if anything, being a woman was an advantage, especially compared to the US, right? She was talking about how she had never been in a situation where someone mistook her for a paralegal. She had never been in a situation where she was thought of as a secretary. When she called, no one said, hey, is your senior lawyer around? Can I talk to your boss? Right? The sort of normal trope of things that you expect to happen when you think about women in prestigious workforces. That made me realize that, it then struck me that a lot of the people I was talking to in these firms were women I started looking at like firm level data for these top law firms, and I realized that of the 3 of the 5 most prestigious law firms in the country, 50% of the partnership is female, right? We're not talking entry, we're talking partnership. Just to give you a sense of like the big numbers, I'm gonna try using this laser stuff. Yes, it works. So in the US, that's the sort of legal profession, the feminization of the legal profession is about 34%. That is all the women that are in the broader legal profession, independent of what the actual practice is. That's sort of average across the world. There's a demographer of the legal profession, Ethan Michelson at Indiana, and he's a sociologist who studies like percentages of female participation within the legal profession. And 30%, 35%, 30 to 35% is the average amount of feminization that has happened over the last 3 decades, right? So that figure there that the US has is a very average figure of how many people stay in the profession that are women. India, on the other hand, you will see has 5% women, right? So that's the starting point of all the lawyers in the country, which is 1.1 million lawyers or so. No one knows how many different sources we have that number from, but about 5% of people that report that they are lawyers in the census are female. In contrast, look at the elite law firm entry, right? So the US has about 44, almost 45% of people at entry are women in elite law firms. That's common. Our law schools are half women now, which means that, acceptance into firms is half women. That doesn't seem that surprising at all. But what's interesting is that that's not where the jump happens. The place where you find women not being represented is like at much more senior levels of partnership, right? So everybody goes to law school at about the same rate. We start work at about the same rate. And then the big jump happens about 7 to 8 years after you enter the law school circuit. Why does this happen? We have X number of explanations for it. You have babies, life happens, you decide that this is not what you want to do. And of course, women are the ones making these choices because you can't imagine that an ideal type worker who's a man might make the same choice, right? So the fact that there's 20% of partnership in elite law firms, and that's non-equity partnership. If you looked at just managing partnership at the equity level, it's about 4% at the elite firms, right? So you're looking at a very, very small number of women in elite law firms. But in India, the contrast is about 50% at partnership, right? So that jump is empirically just really significant in terms of what these new countries and these new economies that have, when I say new countries, I mean new kinds of firms and transitional economies that are responding to strong pressures of globalization are showing us in terms of how female representation can look in prestigious workforces. This is the existing explanation for feminization of any workspace, right? The first is a very essentialized sort of workspace. Women are really good at caretaking. Women just make better administrative assistants because they're so good at their job, right? They make better nurses because they're just caring and helpful. All the socialized explanations that you would expect for why women ought to fill up certain professional spots is the one major explanation for why there's feminization in certain fields. The second is sort of a subfieldist explanation, and that is the fact that the minute women start trickling into a professional space, what happens is that it becomes non-generalized very quickly. So there are more women doctors than ever before, but the largest percentage of women doctors are OBGYNs. There are more women lawyers than ever before, but most of them are in family practice, right? So there becomes a non-generalization of the track in which women start populating the professional space. It's very rare to find women in equal numbers or in sometimes exceeding half the percentage in a high status professional workforce where their sort of commitment to the space equals that of their male peers. In this talk, so my broader work talks about not just the institutional level that I'm going to be talking to you about today, but also what happens at the individual level. Where do these people go to school? What kind of class effects is actually trumping them? What kind of interactions do they have with clients? What kind of interactions do they have with mentors? And so this was sort of what David was saying a second ago about how gender is not really just one thing that happens at one level of analysis. You can't just say, oh, women are populating this space, therefore it is X or Y or Z, right? It's a much more complicated mechanism that intervenes across levels of analysis. And these are the three big levels of analysis that come together to show us how gender is done in any sort of given space. The reason I focus on the institutional level today rather than like the individual or the interactional is not because I think that those mechanisms aren't at play, but there's something really cool happening for the legal profession that like we can take a few lessons out of by focusing on just the institutional level alone, right? So feel free to ask me questions when I finish the talk about stuff at the other levels of analysis. The fact that I'm not focusing on it doesn't mean that they don't exist. It's much more the fact that for this talk, I'm going to focus on the organizational level. I'm going to focus on how these firms are different organizationally from other firms, and how this salience is sort of playing into the larger framework of why women do well in these firms. There are two things I want to say, though. At the individual level, one of the biggest sort of pushbacks I get to this talk is, what about class? Like rich, powerful women everywhere do better than men. So yay, it's a class argument. Why is this a gender paper, right? And I want you to take this leap of faith with me when I say that in this scenario, I hold class constant in most organizations. And women with the same class characteristics and the same background and the same school don't do as well across all the different organizations, right? So there's a tapering out in most organizations in India, even within law, and it's only in very elite corporate law firms that women do well, right? So there is something salient about the organization over and above all the other things that are definitely at play. And in terms of interactions, there's definitely a big trope of like feminist women in work literature that talks about how women don't ask as much, women aren't, women are just not strong enough, women are very quick to just say, they don't say no often enough, right? Like they're very deferent. And this essentialized reason is one of the reasons why women don't do well. They don't ask for as much as they deserve. In the Indian context, actually, it works a little bit differently. The fact that they don't ask so much, the fact that they're not aggressive, the fact that they are not seen as, hot-headed actually works to their favor. So I speak to clients as well in my work, and it's very interesting how they'll come back and say, you want someone to handle this with a cool head. You don't want to go to litigation in India. And one of the things that's really nice about a woman is that she's going to make it work, and people behave when there's a woman in the room, right? So there's a lot of gender at play, but it seems to work out very differently because the institutional framework within which it works just has different expectations for what is deemed necessary to get the job done. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to sort of try and talk about is actually a paper that isn't this paper, but a previous paper I wrote about just the frames argument, right? So there's a recent book by Cecilia Ridgway, who's a feminist scholar. She's a social psychologist, and she writes about how there are different frames of reference that we start with, and they really impede the way we think about work. They really impede the way we think about our interactions. And in turn, they can set expectations for how institutions are deployed and orient themselves and reproduce, etc. The big sort of takeaway for the gender and work literature that this has is it instantly makes you think about how an ideal type worker should be and how a deviation from that ideal type is met with backlash, right? So when you think of a lawyer in the American context, it's amazing. I went to Google Images today to get this, and I was like, lawyer, US, and all the pictures are of men in courtrooms. Well, so you sort of see that as a very quintessential typical lawyer who's a man, who's aggressive, right? Somebody who can really hold his own in the courtroom. And it's an essentialized idea of what a lawyer needs to do or needs to be. Definitely that's been changing. The Good Wife is a great show, and there are lots of different shows that sort of bring into the public mindset what you think of as a great lawyer. But it's an established field with a very strong preconceived identity of what this person ought to look like, right? And I don't mean ought to actually physically look like, but what characteristics are thought to be valorized within that occupation. In contrast, you think of a corporate law firm partner, and you think of an older person. Actually, what do you think about? When I've been swimming in this data for 3 years, right? So I know what I think of when I think of an corporate law firm. Does anyone want to tell me what they think about when they think of a corporate law firm equity partner? Close your eyes. Actually, don't. Just tell me what you think. Come on. Come on. Yes.
An older white man.
Thank you. I'm so glad I put that picture up. But you're right, like an older white man, right? Like, and you think of sort of, were you going to say something else?
I think of my mother.
That's fantastic. Have you always thought of, have you had other people in the family that were lawyers? Okay, are your parents in the law? So I wonder, like, you're right, like if you have a personal, that's actually a really good point. If you have a personal association, you're likely to think of that person, but if you don't, the common image is very much that of an older person that's gotten advantage of this. So the reason I put this up here is that in the Indian case, this didn't exist, right? There was no corporate law firm until 1991. 1991 was the first time that we started having what we now think of as the corporate law firm model, right? So it was globalization sort of came to India in 91 in some sense. Markets were open for international investment in 91. So a bunch of different things happened. Traditional practice, which was like organized around lawyers' offices, changed. The kind of clients changed. You no longer had individual private clients that were in your social networks. You started getting like companies, you started getting sophisticated clients, but you also started getting international clients for the first time, right? So you were also doing new kinds of work, you were doing it for new kinds of people, and you were doing it within new kinds of firms. When I do this talk, there's always this moment when I have to like step back and think, this is India, I'm giving a talk on gender, and of course, like everyone's gonna be like, yeah, great, so a bunch of people think gender doesn't matter, cool, like, but what about the pre-existing framework of India, right? It absolutely exists, right? India is still thought of as an incredibly gendered country. There's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of hierarchy that like comes into play. Within the legal industry itself, it's very male-dominated. There's a lot of traditional practice that, like, you know, that is the main form of it. But the thing about these new firms is that they are seen as not really part of that law, right? This is the new global law. This is like the new international law that's being done for international clients in offices that sort of look like New York offices. Right? There's this whole new organizational revolution that has happened in the last 30 years that didn't happen before. The sort of distinction that I'm going to try and make, like theoretically for me, is that it changed not just the work that was being done, but it also changed the kind of gendered frames that attach to it. Right? So there are still from my fieldwork, there's a lot of like rich data about how older non-law firm lawyers, right? So people in litigation will come up to me and say, yeah, but she's a woman, or like there's a lot of gendered talk around litigation practice. There's a lot of gendered talk around how work happens outside of these firms. And even within these firms, there is some sort of acceptance that gender plays into the roles of it. But the big difference is it isn't structured predominantly as a traditional practice, and that changes the way these people view their work, and that changes the way the organizations are structured. I argue that as an innovative site that is doing new work in a new premise, they have this additional advantage that is capable of renegotiating accepted gender hierarchies, right? There's a line of research that contrasts tech firms in the Silicon Valley with biotech firms in the Silicon Valley, right? So you think of like these new firms that are, that don't have office spaces, that have beanbags instead of chairs, like, this new kind of organizations, as spaces where old hierarchies are less likely to play in, right? But when they're in the tech sector, which is a very male-dominated sector in the US, that's less likely to work there than it is in a sector like biotech, which is thought of as, oh, that's like not really gendered. So if you place it in a gender ambiguous field and it's a new organization, that's where women are likely to do most well. So following that train of research, this shows that, well, it's brand new, it's new work, they're most likely to do well. The extension of this frame's argument, however, is that all firms that are new, all firms that work with international clients, and absolutely every firm that is doing new kinds of corporate law is and should have a 50% partnership rate that's female, right? Like if this is just firms, then everything should work out for pretty much every firm that is there. But this doesn't happen. It's only in the top firms that women seem to like insist that gender doesn't matter. You go down to like firm 10, which is a smaller firm that doesn't look like a big New York law firm, that doesn't have fancy art off its wall, that doesn't have stationery, which is what a lot of like, firms that are still prestigious in the Indian market, but not particularly global firms in some sense. The difference is those firms are not giving you the same sort of gendered results that you see in the very, very top firms. Which brings me to like the next big difference between these firms and, say, the other big professions that are in India, right? The biggest difference that Indian legal profession has vis-a-vis other sort of elite sites of professional work is that the legal profession is the only professional space that does not have investment from outside the country. So in other words, foreign law firms are not allowed to actually invest into Indian markets. So there's no Clifford Chance in India, there's no Linklaters in India, there's no sort of space for you to have an Indian firm that is directly connected to a foreign firm. So this is the sort of difference that is key, right? So law is, there's some part of it has emerged post-91, the new work has happened post-91, but everything else, the fact that a field like consulting, which is the big sort of professional field that I contrast my results in, is not just new. It was a completely elite new industry that came in after 91. It was a product of globalization. It was not just a global organization, because it sort of was. They were, McKinsey and Bain, and you name it. Every big management consulting group has an India office. But they were also brand new organizations, right? So I hypothesized that, well, if you were going to find something just because they were exposed to the West, if what was really making these frames stick was exposure to global influences, then where you're most likely to find it is like in global organizations, right? Because then it has all of these things. It has a brand new site, it has a brand new frame of reference, and it's global. So it's even more global than the Indian firms, right? So that's where you're most likely to have found it. So this was the final case in my 4-case study, which I finally finished in 2014. So I feel like this is just hot off the press. For a long time, this was just a legal professions project. But with this, you can sort of see how this plays out, not just in the legal profession, but what global influences can do when they are attached to the firm in the emerging market and when they're not, right? So the sort of consulting firms are firms that have India offices, whereas the law firms are firms that are emerging with the assumption of what the global offices are, but no real relationship to them. So when I say global facing, that's what I mean. So it's like this, the big differences between the elite law firm here and the international banking and consulting, right? So you would imagine that this is where the most advantage for women are, using the frames argument. But instead, it is here that women are most likely to report big frame differences. And it got me to thinking, what is it about these new law firms? What is it about the fact that these law firms exist in this emerging country market that allows these women to truly believe that gender doesn't operate in the way that it does in traditional elite workspaces? And this is sort of, this gets to one set of mechanisms that I think is going on here. So that's a senior partner at an elite law firm. And this was actually a man who said this to me. And like it codes very similarly to other people in that firm, all of whom spoke about how gender didn't matter, right? Which was this big finding when I was writing the frames paper. And the argument was, things like gender discrimination, gender harassment, that just isn't there. Look, we have equal number of male and female partners. A thought like this doesn't even arise. The culture is just different here, right? So there's a strong emphasis on the word culture, the assumption of what that culture is. And it's a very like hand to empirics sort of response, right? Like, look at us, we have like equal partners. Like, of course we don't think about gender as a situation here. Of course gender doesn't matter. In contrast, consultants sort of felt like gender of course worked. I mean, you'd be blind to not see gender working out in a situation like this. So this senior consultant actually says, as a company, the firm is extremely committed to making gender a priority. Notice again, this is a difference organizationally too. The management consulting firm actually has serious commitment to making gender as a priority, works very hard to make sure there are like groups where women can feel important. There's a lot of training about gender awareness. There's much more structural investment in making gender a non-issue in this workspace. So she says, I know they put a lot of thought into it, and across the world they've been more successful. But you have to realize this is India. So no matter how many interventions you make, at the end of the day, it is going to be affected by how things play out in the ground. Most people at the firm are those who are nice about it. But there are still people who will say something stupid or sexist, and you have to learn to deal with it. Right? So this is a very common result when people do sort of international comparisons of this sort of work. So you find that local offices of global firms often have this sort of decoupling with the ideal type, right? So John Mayer, who's a institutional scholar in sociology, came up with the concept of a world society. So the idea is all sorts of organizations start trying to look alike because they're trying to conform with what they imagine to be the ideal type. But this sort of ceremony that they do of compliance is often just a structural ceremony, right? So more and more things start looking the same, but it's really just to show that it is the same. So classrooms around the world start looking the same, offices around the world start looking the same, but if you actually look at the substance of it, nothing has really changed. So it's still the assumption that, yeah, you can like sort of port an ideal type, you can make something look the same across the world, but it's going to have its local influence that makes it very different at the local level, right? So the fact that, it's India, of course it's going to work out like this, didn't seem to worry this person, right? She was still very happy with her job. Like the rest of the interview was this glowing account of how her professional life was very complimentary, but she did accept that gender was one of those things that you couldn't help because you were in India. So the acceptance of external norms as being something that is inevitable, that's going to like come into the way she deals with her everyday life, was a given in this scenario, which is very different from the ways that the lawyers spoke about it, very different from the ways the partners in this big elite firm spoke about it, right? And this was my favorite. This was the end of a long interview where I was talking to this woman. You know, she was like, I don't know, like we have all these things. We have a women in the workforce group. We try to meet for brunch every week. It was very similar to the first law firm interview, if you remember, of the woman who came to New York. It was like, oh, we practically do everything that people do all over the world. It seems to have more success outside. It just doesn't have success here. And her sort of end note was, she was referencing a lawyer who she'd spoken to one of the law firm partners from one of these elite firms, and she's like, they seem to be doing this right, but we don't know what they're doing, right? It doesn't seem obvious that they're doing something right. They don't have programs. It's not like they have a creche. It's not like they have, maternity leave that's well thought out. It's not like they're really doing this consciously, but somehow, accidentally, they seem to be having a very different life course experience than us, and I wonder what it is. And the truth was, I didn't have an answer for her then because I hadn't coded my data. But when I went back and sort of thought about it, there were two big themes that emerged from what the lawyers were saying about their life, their career course, and what the consultants were saying. And it sort of came down to two broad logics, right? I call these the mimicking logics and the differentiation logics. The differentiation logic was this very strong, we are not like the traditional firms logic. So it was this very strong differentiation of, we're not like backward. We're not one of those firms that cares about gender so much that we're going to come in the way. We're going to be very modern, right? Like it's not like those traditional firms where they think about gender in very essentialized terms. It's not like the past where we thought about gender in very essentialized terms. We are different. So it's a very strong differentiation logic from everything else. And there's a strong mimicking logic, right? So it's not just that we are not like them. We are also like you, right? So the second part of that argument is not so much that they wanted to set themselves apart from other firms that they were competing with within the local market. They also wanted to be able to signal very strongly that they believed in meritocracy. The merit is everything. The number of times people spoke about merit, it was never gender. It was always merit, right? Merit was the sort of the shtick that they put all their energies on. That was what they thought they were doing. They're like, of course we're going to be meritocratic, because when you are meritocratic, you just make this work. I know there's a lot of individual level explanations for why this merit looked the way it did as opposed to like some other way, right? It could have been a championing of diversity in a range of other factors. It took on this sort of gender out there for a range of reasons that you can't look at just at the organizational level. But it definitely was one version of how they thought they were signaling merit. They did not want to be seen as one of these firms that was blind to meritocracy. They did not want to be seen as one of these firms that was not like that. But they also wanted to be seen as a firm that was like picking up cues from the West. They did not have strong alliances with Western firms, so there was a broad cultural diffusion of what they assumed the West sort of thought was important. They had a lot of sophisticated international clients. They were definitely pandering to the West in some sense. And it says, you know, we are like any, bless you, we are like any international law firm. Merit is everything, right? So merit was what was giving you the gender outcome. So it was more a mechanism that they thought of as meritocratic than an actual feminist result. So I think this goes back to like the frame's argument in some sense, right? So there's a big difference in what kind of organization you work for, who the audience for that organization is, but then there's also the fact that there are lots of cultural assumptions that firms make, both in terms of their limited capacity, but also in terms of who they think their audience is. And one of the cultural assumptions that you make when you're a local firm that's trying to compete in a global market is that people outside are really going to care about meritocracy. So you better work your darnest to make sure that you don't come across as like sexist. Remember, this is all happening at a time when India is thought to be incredibly sexist, right? It's happening at a time where India is in the news for gender for all the wrong reasons. So having this happen, like, is one way of signaling and saying, we're so meritocratic, like we don't even know how this is, you know, why would this be an issue? We are so international, this doesn't matter. On the other hand, the global firms that had India offices could just really easily say, well, you know, this is India, it doesn't work. They were not sort of trying to put out these legitimacy fires that the Indian firms were. Consultants that were in Bombay like didn't have to actually do things to feel like they were part of a modern meritocratic firm. No one's going to ask McKinsey, for example, if they are modern and international, right? So they didn't need to like do this little differentiation mimicking logic to come to the same state that local firms that are competing in a global market for sort of obvious regulatory reasons felt like they were in a position that they needed to. So I want to end here because I definitely want to have a discussion, and I know a lot of you have classes at 1. The sort of big takeaway from this for me was how feminism often is like thought about as this, you know, structured, the gender project is often thought about as this very mind-on, let's take organizations and lean in for all the right reasons, right? Like I teach a big gender class, and this is one of those things that I teach, and I think it's actually important for us to think about gender and the ways it works in very like absolute matters. But this is a case where that was not what was happening. It wasn't a feminist organization because these people stood up one day and said, hey, let's be feminist, right? And I don't think they still think of each other as like totally committed to the gender project. This is the managing partner who said, I think we truly believe it's a meritocracy, but look at the line before that. And the environment we've been able to create, sometimes not consciously, but it's just happened that way, right? I think we believe it's a meritocracy. So a large part of this is not because they're trying to weave a new organization where gender does not matter. At least some part of it is that they set it up as a strongly meritocratic firm. They set it up as a firm that was international. And because they didn't like sort of tamper gender as playing out, this happened to become the only space where women that entered and worked really hard would move ahead. So it was the lack of stereotype rather than the presence of advantage, right? And that distinction is sort of important to take away in terms of thinking about how gender initiatives and things that you think of as organizational remedies can work in this scenario. I'm going to stop here, but thank you very much for listening.
So you have the slide towards the beginning that said overall in the Indian legal market it's about 5% women, but 50% of partnership at the elite law firms are women. So women are very heavily overrepresented in the partnership level at law firms. And why do you think that is? Like, is that just the trap that women go into?
Yeah.
That the other firms don't want women because they're stuck in the older mindset pre-1991?
I'm glad you asked the question. So the number of firms that actually do this kind of work are a very small percentage of it. I mean, it's true everywhere, but it's even more scarce in India than anywhere else. So 20% of like the American legal profession is sort of private practice and law firm practice. About 1%, like maybe at best 2% is like firm practice, right? And the women that go into these firms are usually women that have gone to the same set of really elite schools, which accept at 50%. And then they try to get into these top firms. And once they're in these top firms, I think the hostility or the assumed hostility of the rest of the environment is so strong, they don't want to leave, right? So part of it is also, I'm here, I have it good. If I get out of here, it's going to be really crummy, so I'm going to stay here, right? So they're probably working harder at it to stay than others. So that 50% is probably already gender making its work, right? Because the chances, if you had a pro-gendered organization, you might have 80-20 because they're that much better, but what you're seeing is already a gendered effect, but it's still a stark jump from what you see anywhere else.
Yeah, so if you're having new firms, which is my understanding of your presentation, you have new firms, and they don't have, because they don't have the kind of existing culture, maybe in Western countries, there's an opportunity for them to become a space for potential meritocracy.
Yes.
But they're not doing it necessarily intentionally, it's just happening on its own. Why wouldn't there be pressure for these new firms if they're trying to resemble Western counterparts to incorporate some of those frameworks and say, we're a new firm, our Western counterparts, 20% male partnership, that's the standard of a global company?
20% female partnership.
Excuse me, 20% female partnership, and try to replicate that and have pressure kind of existing in that.
In the opposite direction.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question is, if they're actually just trying to mimic, why aren't they mimicking exactly the way these firms look here? Why are they mimicking in this unusual fraction that's deviant from the norm, right? The difference is they don't actually think about these firms as doing really well. So if you speak to my data from the partners right on top varies from people thinking, meritocracy works this way there, right? Like there's no connection to the West in terms of like there are no firms that they are attached to. So they don't have any sort of strong relationships with like law firms in the US. So a lot of what they are getting from the situation is just that egalitarianism and meritocracy is big, right? And this is one way that you can one-up the structure that's there. So some people think of it as a strategy to circumvent what is happening everywhere else. So that last partner that was talking about, look at us doing diversity so much better than people there. Like we've figured out a way to do this differently. And then there are other partners who will say, isn't this true? Isn't the West also like 50-50? Like there isn't a strong knowledge of what it actually looks like. So there's a range of deviance in like how they think the West is structured. But the one culturally diffused script is that the West is meritocracy. Like that's the sort of strong assumption that has diffused without any need to have the knowledge at the gritty level. I call it speculative isomorphism. So the big theory is firms start looking the same over time, and so they usually start mimicking the firms that they're trying to mimic. But in this case, they don't have the blueprints of the firms that they're trying to mimic. They have like no structure to try and mimic. So they're mimicking in the dark somewhat, right? And this mimicking is giving them this outcome that sort of looks super modern. It's giving them an outcome that makes them comply to the spirit of what they think these other firms are structured on, and it gives them an advantage because they're starting from so much worse a standpoint than just Western firms.
Maybe as a follow-up to that, but then that would the assumption then that this opportunity can only exist in these kind of rare spaces where there's not the intro stereotypes, and then and there's potentially not a blueprint to mimic places where there are. So places that do have these intro stereotypes
are doomed. It's really sad. but it's true though. It's true though, right? Like we know that even when we try and innovate in spaces that you think are brand new, it's almost impossible because there's no such thing as a virgin birth for an organization. There just isn't. There's pre-existing frameworks that attach to everything, right? But I think globalization gives you this new, like, sort of sidekick wand to say, it's global, and like global people like X, right? Which changes the way you think about labor. It changes the way you think about standards. It changes your own cultural assumptions about what is right. And work on international labor, like more generally, definitely sees this effect of globalization in terms of like how gender sort of reinvents itself. But there's little work done at this level. So even if you see it happen at like less prestigious levels or more labor-intensive levels, it usually doesn't happen at like high-status professional spaces where men are competing for the same jobs. So that's the bit that's the one sliver of hope. Yes.
I guess the one thing I was a little bit curious about,
yes,
when you were talking to consulting firms in India, did you talk to any of the male partners who thought that gender was was it very much the same framework that it is here, where you talk to, generally if you talk to a guy, they're going to say, no, we moved beyond gender.
Right.
Was it the same thing?
It was a little scary, like how scripted the whole thing was. The men were like, of course it doesn't matter. Women for the first 5 years were like, of course it doesn't matter. Why are we trying to have like women initiatives? It's like, taking us back to the start. It's like, we want to just be treated as non-women. And by year 5, they're like, we need to bring back these brunches because this is like not working out, right? So the woman, the senior consultant who was actually organizing these women initiatives within the consulting firm was like, the men don't seem to think this matters at all, right? And the women don't seem to think it matters for the first 5 years. So they actually think we're pulling them down with them by trying to argue that we need these groups. And so it's very similar to the way this plays out in elite firms here. Yeah. But part of that is also they know the script, right? So they're like, yeah, it doesn't work in Boston. Like, how is it going to work in Bangalore, right? Like, there's no reason it's going to work here.
In your research, I think you've spoken a lot about law firms and litigation. There's another related area which I was very curious to know. How about the in-house structure in India?
Yeah.
Because I think so many people from the law schools have started going to in-house jobs, and a lot of women obviously are going there. Mm-hmm. So do you see the same kind of merit to prestige being replicated in-house, and the kind of promotions that they're getting, are they able to match in terms of law firms?
I'm really glad you asked me that question, because it brings another paper into the discussion. So I did speak to in-house counsel and like people that worked in in-house teams, and there's a big difference again there, right? So there are in-house companies that started post-91 that are like sort of global companies where people work for, and then there are the old firms the old companies in India that have lasted for like hundreds of years that like were established by the British and still happen to be there, which have very strong rules and regulations of how this works. So the way to tease that out like sort of worked for me much more in the frames paper, where I could say, well, there are pre-existing frameworks because gender works a certain way at the top level as well in terms of how it's set up. But there wasn't enough, there's enough of a sample in terms of how many people work at the junior levels. There just aren't enough female GCs, right? Like at that level for you to like make that comparison. So gender definitely trickles down there, but they're also working in a work environment that isn't really legal. So if you think about the legal profession, it doesn't compare quite the same to a consultant's job or an elite law firm partner's job, right? Like the kind of scope of work is somewhat different. But yeah, the gendered frames where they thought about work as very hierarchical and very old school male was very strong in the in-house counterparts. Where that didn't happen was the banks. The in-house banks were the difference where women were finding footing, and that was because a lot of the senior women at these banks were women because they were international banks.
So what do you think will happen when or if the Indian labor market opens?
I hate that question. Well, I love that question because it sets me up for my next project. Because it's a natural experiment, right? You wait for the market to open, then you see what happens once the market opens and whether it contrasts differently from the others. Now, honestly, I think it's a short-lived advantage. I think so there's two parts to it. I think at the organizational level, it's sort of a short-lived advantage because they're not going to have this, they're not going to have the same advantage of not having other frameworks or other partners to mimic very soon, hopefully. But on the other side, like the bit that makes me happy, and it takes a lot to make a sociologist happy, the bit that makes me happy is that it also is a very early stage in the development process of the organization. And the fact that there are so many women at high sort of partnership level positions now means that they're setting the tone for what the organizations are going to be when they move forward, right? Which is sort of promising, right? Because if you think about it as setting the tone of like how the institutions get emerged over time, the fact that there are women at like these high positions could change the way these firms like sort of diversify and think of themselves 10 years down the line. It looks like you have a question, Nick.
Yeah, so I guess one question I had is just thinking about, and I don't like this question either, implications of this in the sense of, because you're saying in a way like a false consciousness about what's going on the outside is a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, yeah.
And you know, these training programs that kind of sets you up for a certain framing. And so I'm just thinking about in other countries and other industries.
Yeah.
You know, what can be taken away from this in terms of how you try to emerge, especially in the developing world, in these in new professional settings. How do you aim for gender equality?
I hope the takeaway from this talk is not that gender policies in large firms is a bad idea, right? Like that. But you're right. The fact that the finding is that sort of spaces of ambiguities where success happens is a little bit troubling as a policy recommendation. But I think the takeaway that I think is like most important is we think of the legal profession, we think of institutional, we think of institutional formation as a very north-south process, right? We think it happens in the global north, and the global south sort of mimics it. And part of the theory that this sort of tries and speaks to is that bigger theory, which is that, no, you can go to an emerging economy and find things that happen in spite of this north-south, like sort of boundary formation, right? So institutions don't always have to go crazy when they get replicated. Sometimes they can be better than the forms they're trying to emulate, and that's actually a good thing. So globalization is actually giving us this tiny window, and the post-colonial scholars hate me for this, but it gives you a tiny window to see the ways in which assumptions about the West can reorganize in positive ways, right?
And I would say it applies beyond gender, because you
right.
can imagine these law firms, in some cases, mimicking the West,
right.
But doing it in this sheltered way, in a sense, and then importing their own eccentricities or whatever it may be into the thing when it comes to billing or
right.
hiring.
Right. Like, so in the 3 years that I've been going back and forth to India for this fieldwork, the area where these top law firms exist, like, went from being, completely downtrodden, like nobody wanted to live there, it was like the back of beyond, to like midtown. They would actually call it midtown. They're like, are you going downtown or like midtown? You're like, what? Like, what? Like, when did this place that's like, it's Parade, like it's not midtown. Like, why is this being called? You're right. There's a lot of like cultural mimicking that happens that is beyond just the kind of work that's being done, and like that and it's happening very quickly, right? So people that study the global legal profession, like one of the reasons the emerging economies are so exciting is that stuff's happening much quicker in like a movement process, like an organizational movement process, than anywhere else, because it has to happen really quickly to just keep abreast of like the innovation outside of it. Done.
We have the room for 10 more minutes, so if you would just join me in thanking Rachel.